12 meters below London's modern streets lies a layer of scorched clay, bright crimson, sometimes half a meter thick, sometimes thicker. It marks the moment an entire settlement was obliterated in a single day. Above it, 2 millennia of building and destruction have compressed into a vertical chronicle of endurance. Roman fortifications entombed beneath medieval groundwork. Medieval burial grounds concealed by Victorian drainage systems. Victorian tenements leveled by wartime explosives. The metropolis that stands today rests upon everything that preceded it. Every disaster became framework. Every ruin became bedrock. This is not the account of London's landmarks or its victories. This is the account of the mechanisms that determined survival, the establishments that preserved control through force, the pestilences that exterminate half the inhabitants, the conflagrations that blazed for days, the atmosphere that became poisonous, the water that turned deadly, and the people who endured it all or perished. This is the metropolis of darkness. Londinium did not exist before Rome's arrival. There was no community on the location, no tribal encampment, no hallowed terrain. The position was selected for military advantage in approximately 47 CE. The Thames could be crossed here at its narrowest navigable point. Roman thoroughfares could extend outward in all directions. Vessels could sail upriver from the coast. Within a generation, the settlement became a trading center for the entire province of Britannia. The inhabitants were cosmopolitan from inception. Archaeological findings show residents from throughout the Roman domain. A man of black African descent, beyond 46 years at death. Gravestones mentioning mariners from Celtic territories, traders from Antioch, artisans from Athens, moneylenders from what is now Switzerland. The settlement attracted people who recognized possibility in imperial conquest. They constructed rapidly. Buildings used sun-baked clay bricks, wooden frameworks, thatched coverings. The building methods emphasized velocity over durability. By 60 CE, Londinium was a flourishing mercantile hub with a port, trading square, and housing quarters extending along both shores of the Thames. The prosperity concentrated there was evident. Foreign merchandise filled storehouses. Currency circulated in amounts that indicated substantial commercial activity. The settlement projected affluence. That affluence made it an objective. The Iceni people controlled land to the northeast. Their ruler, Prasutagus, had preserved cordial relations with Rome through a client agreement. When he perished, Roman officials moved to incorporate his territory directly. They whipped his widow, Boudica. They violated her daughters. The Roman chronicler Tacitus documented these actions as bureaucratic protocol, not deviation. Boudica assembled an armed force. The Iceni were joined by adjacent peoples who had their own complaints against Roman levies and military presence. The uprising moved south toward the bastions of Roman authority. Camulodunum, the provincial headquarters, collapsed first. The insurgents annihilated the community completely. Then they advanced toward Londinium. The settlement had no military detachment. Its barriers were commercial, not protective. When reports of the approaching force reached Londinium, the procurator Catus Decianus escaped to Gaul. Tacitus documented that the Roman administrator, Suetonius Paulinus, made an assessment. He could not protect the settlement with the troops available. He commanded withdrawal. Those who could depart did. Those who remained were the aged, the disabled, and those who believed they could conceal themselves or safeguard their assets. The Iceni arrived and incinerated everything. The archaeological stratum documenting this annihilation is designated the Boudiccan Horizon. It manifests as a band of bright crimson scorched daub, typically 30 to 60 centimeters thick. In some locations where wreckage accumulated in open depressions, it reaches 1.5 meters. The hue derives from sun-baked clay bricks that ignited at temperatures high enough to vitrify the substance. The stratum extends across what is now the city of London and Southwark, verifying the uprising crossed the Thames. Excavations have uncovered concealed hoards within this destruction stratum. Gemstones interred in the soil at East Cheap, currency hidden near King William Street. The hoards indicate residents attempted to secure precious items before fleeing, planning to retrieve them once the peril passed. Most never returned. The brutality was ceremonial. Tacitus portrayed the handling of captured women with particular attention to impalement and disfigurement. These narratives emphasized the perceived savagery of the tribal armies compared to Roman civilization. The actual casualty count is unknown. What is definite is that Londinium ceased to function as a viable community. For over a century, scholars connected the Walbrook skulls with this slaughter. More than 100 human skulls were extracted from the Walbrook watercourse, which flows through the core of the Roman settlement. Contemporary examination shows the skulls lack injuries consistent with combat casualties. The current interpretation proposes they reflect subsequent burial customs, possibly ceremonial disposal of remains. The Boudiccan slaughter left no skeletal proof in the ash stratum itself. The Roman military reaction was methodical. Suetonius returned with legions and vanquished the rebel armies in a direct engagement. Tacitus asserted 80,000 Britons perished. Boudicca consumed poison rather than accept seizure. The province was subdued through killings and terror. Londinium was reconstructed with a different nature. A military installation was erected to accommodate a permanent detachment. The forum and basilica were enlarged to fulfill bureaucratic purposes. The governor's residence was constructed on a magnitude that proclaimed permanent control. The new settlement incorporated sections of protective barrier using the existing Roman road network as its boundary. What had been a commercial community became a fortified bureaucratic headquarters. The ash stratum beneath recorded what necessitated that conversion. William the Conqueror vanquished Harold Godwinson at Hastings on October 14th, 1066. By December, he was crowned sovereign in Westminster Abbey. London yielded without meaningful opposition, acknowledging that resistance would invite the devastation recently exhibited across southern England. But yielding did not mean confidence. William grasped this. The metropolis was prosperous, heavily inhabited, and had a long tradition of demanding its privileges against royal power. Domination would require permanent fortification. Building of the Tower of London commenced almost instantly. The location incorporated existing Roman barriers along the eastern perimeter of the settlement. The position was tactical. It commanded access from the Thames. It overlooked the approach from the east. Most significantly, it sat within the settlement itself, not beyond as a conventional fortress would. A contemporary writer noted that William constructed the tower to intimidate hostile Londoners. The fortification oriented inward as much as outward. The White Tower, the central stronghold, was finished around 1100. The edifice used carnstone transported from Normandy, a material selection that announced foreign domination. The barriers were over 4 meters thick at the foundation. Openings on the lower stories were narrow apertures, unsuitable for domestic ease but practical for protection. The structure was engineered to resist assault from a hostile urban inhabitants. Over subsequent centuries, the tower developed into a complex of structures surrounded by concentric barriers and a ditch. It fulfilled multiple roles simultaneously. The Royal Mint functioned there from 1279 to 1812, manufacturing the kingdom's coinage under military safeguard. The Royal Armoury stored weaponry. The crown jewels were maintained in secured chambers. Sovereigns occasionally resided in the royal quarters, though the tower's fundamental objective was never accommodation. Its most lasting role was confinement and killing. The legal doctrine governing the tower was demonstrative brutality. The state employed spectacular punishment to preserve social stratification through terror. Most killings occurred on Tower Hill, an elevated stage outside the fortress barriers, but within the Tower Liberty, a bureaucratic zone managed by the Constable of the Tower. Between 1381 and 1780, roughly 125 people were killed there. These were communal spectacles. Masses assembled. The sentenced were exhibited through the streets from their cells. The procession itself was component of the punishment, a visual exhibition of state authority over individual existence. Private killings inside the tower on Tower Green were designated for high-ranking captives whose communal deaths might stimulate compassion or disturbance. Only 10 people obtained this handling. Anne Boleyn was decapitated there in 1536, accused of infidelity and betrayal. Her death was observed by a small assembly of officials, not the community. The privacy was not clemency. It was political strategy. The tower's captives chronicled the instability of authority in medieval and Tudor England. Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, was confined in 1101 and became the first documented captive to flee, using a cord smuggled in a wine barrel. William Wallace, the Scottish opposition commander, was detained briefly in 1305 before his killing. Simon of Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, was extracted from the tower and murdered on Tower Hill by a crowd during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. His death exhibited that even religious power offered no immunity when popular rage overwhelmed institutional control. The most famous vanishing occurred in 1483. Edward IV perished unexpectedly, leaving his 12-year-old son as successor. The boy and his younger brother were accommodated in the tower, ostensibly for security during the power transition. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, proclaimed their parents' union invalid, rendering the children illegitimate and clearing his route to the throne as Richard III. The boys were observed less regularly in the tower grounds. By summer, they were no longer apparent at all. In 1674, labourers demolishing a stairwell in the White Tower uncovered a wooden container holding the skeletons of 2 children. The remains were presumed to be the princes and were reinterred in Westminster Abbey. No contemporary forensic analysis has been authorized. The question of who commanded their deaths remains unresolved, though Richard III is the most frequently suspected individual. The tower's involvement in the vanishing is transparent. It was the location where troublesome successors could be detained and, if required, eliminated without communal observation. Guy Fawkes was questioned in the tower after the gunpowder plot of 1605. The interrogation included coercion, probably on the rack maintained in the cellar of the Queen's house. Fawkes initially resisted, then disclosed names of accomplices. The admissions secured through coercion were utilized to validate further detentions and killings. The tower operated as the state's instrument for extracting intelligence through suffering. The final prominent political captive was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, who was detained there briefly in 1941 after his unauthorized flight to Scotland. By that moment, the tower's function as a detention facility was largely symbolic. Its history, however, remained embedded in the edifice. The killing location on Tower Green is designated with a monument listing those who perished there. The Bloody Tower, where the princes were last observed, remains a visitor attraction. The architecture of domination became legacy, but the original intent was never ornamentation. It was mastery. The pestilence reached London in June 1348. It arrived by vessel from continental harbours already ravaged by the pandemic. The sickness moved through the metropolis with velocity that overwhelmed contemporary comprehension. People developed high fevers. Painful enlargements appeared in lymph nodes under the arms, along the neck, in the groin. These buboes gave the sickness its designation. Death followed within days, sometimes hours. The metropolis in 1348 was heavily inhabited. Calculations placed the inhabitants between 50,000 and 80,000, making it one of the largest settlements in Europe. Housing was concentrated within the old Roman barriers and the newer developments extending beyond them. Multiple households shared edifices constructed with wooden frameworks and thatched coverings. Sanitation was primitive. Waste management relied on cesspits and open drainage channels. The circumstances that made London a thriving commercial hub also made it an optimal environment for sickness transmission. Medical doctrine offered no productive reaction. Physicians trained in universities across Europe comprehended illness through the humoral framework inherited from Greek and Roman medicine. They believed the pestilence resulted from tainted atmosphere, miasma, possibly caused by a planetary configuration that occurred in 1345. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had converged in a manner that some astronomers argued could release harmful vapors from the Earth. Doctors recommended avoiding bathing, which they believed opened pores to tainted atmosphere. They suggested burning fragrant woods like juniper and rosemary to cleanse the air. They bled patients who were already weakened by the sickness. They punctured the buboes, which often accelerated infection. Every rational intervention based on the finest available knowledge failed. The understanding that expertise was futile created psychological crisis alongside the physical disaster. People turned to religious interpretations. The church instructed that the pestilence was divine retribution for human transgression. Prayers intensified. Processions formed, with hundreds of people marching through streets to churches, seeking divine compassion. These assemblies accelerated transmission of the pneumonic form of the pestilence, which spread through respiratory droplets. The casualty count mounted faster than the metropolis could respond. Churchyards filled beyond capacity. Consecrated ground ran out. Authorities excavated massive pestilence pits outside the settlement barriers. Bodies were layered, covered with thin soil, then another layer of bodies added. The magnitude of burial overwhelmed traditional mortuary customs. Individual graves became impossible. Mass burial became standard. The social edifice began to disintegrate. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing about Florence during the same pandemic, portrayed fathers abandoning sick sons, wives leaving husbands to perish alone. The terror of contagion severed the bonds that held medieval society together. London experienced similar breakdown. Laws were disregarded because magistrates were deceased or had escaped. Courts shuttered. Markets ceased operating. Bakers stopped baking. The sounds of urban trade disappeared, replaced by silence, broken only by church bells tolling for the deceased, until authorities prohibited the bells to reduce panic. The fatality rate was roughly 50%. Half of London's inhabitants perished between June 1348 and the spring of 1349. The demographic catastrophe was pure in an economic sense. It killed people but left physical capital untouched. Buildings remained standing. Tools and equipment survived. Land remained productive. What vanished was labor. The immediate consequence was severe labor scarcity. Surviving workers found themselves in a position of unprecedented negotiating strength. Landowners who had previously dictated terms to peasants now competed for scarce labor. Wages rose sharply. Rents declined. The economic relationships that had defined feudal England for centuries inverted within months. The state's reaction was legislative suppression. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-pestilence levels. It restricted worker movement, requiring labourers to accept employment in their home districts rather than seeking better terms elsewhere. It criminalized demands for higher wages. The law represented an attempt to preserve feudal social edifice through force when demographic reality had made that edifice unworkable. The legislation failed. Labor remained scarce. Workers continued to demand and obtain higher wages. Landowners found themselves unable to sustain manor estates that required intensive peasant labor. Many converted agricultural land to sheep pasture, which required fewer workers. Others shifted from feudal obligations to cash-based rental agreements. The transition from a system based on hereditary status to one based on contractual relationships accelerated. By 1400, serfdom had effectively vanished in England. The connection between personal status and land tenure was broken. A peasant could now negotiate a lease, pay rent in currency rather than labor, and move to seek better opportunities. This transformation did not happen because of enlightened policy or ideological change. It happened because the pestilence killed so many people that the old system became impossible to sustain. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 emerged from this tension. The uprising was not primarily about serfdom, which was already collapsing. It was a reaction to the expansion of state authority and new forms of taxation, particularly the poll taxes levied to fund the 100 Years' War with France. The insurgents targeted symbols of legal and in religious power. They incinerated legal records. They killed officials. Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, was extracted from the Tower and decapitated on Tower Hill by the crowd. The uprising was crushed through military force and the killing of its commanders, including Wat Tyler. But the underlying economic transformation continued. The pestilence had created circumstances that made feudalism unworkable. The survivors constructed a different economy, not because they chose to, but because they had no alternative. The demographic catastrophe of 1348 became the foundation for the transition to early modern England. London's bureaucratic geography was fragmented. The metropolis was not a unified jurisdiction, but a patchwork of overlapping powers. The City of London proper had its own administration and tribunals. Westminster operated as a separate bureaucratic hub. Southwark, on the south shore of the Thames, functioned under different regulations. Within and around these major divisions existed smaller zones called liberties, territories claiming exemption from normal legal jurisdiction. These liberties originated in medieval ecclesiastical privileges. Monasteries and religious foundations were granted rights to administer their own lands, gather their own taxes, and dispense their own justice. The Church argued that spiritual establishments required independence from secular interference. Sovereigns granted these privileges in exchange for political support or to demonstrate devotion. Over time, the liberties became embedded in London's legal framework. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 eliminated the religious foundations, but did not clearly resolve the jurisdictional status of their former lands. Many properties were sold to private owners. Others were seized by the Crown. The legal boundaries remained ambiguous. Former ecclesiastical territories claimed to retain their traditional exemptions even after the establishments that originally held them ceased to exist. Alsatia was the most infamous of these zones. The district occupied the Whitefriars Ward, located between Fleet Street and the Thames. The designation came from a Carmelite monastery, the White Friars, established there in the 13th century. After dissolution, the area's jurisdictional status became contested. Residents claimed the district retained its traditional immunity from City of London powers. The claim had no clear legal foundation, but enforcement proved difficult. The physical arrangement made intervention hazardous. Alsatia consisted of narrow, labyrinthine passages and courtyards. Buildings were packed tightly together. Multiple entrances and exits created routes for escape that outsiders could not navigate effectively. The architecture itself became a protective system. The district evolved into a refuge for debtors. Imprisonment for debt was common in early modern England. Creditors could have debtors detained and held in confinement until the debt was paid. For many, this created an impossible situation. They could not earn currency to pay debts while confined. Alsatia offered an alternative. Debtors who reached the district claimed sanctuary. They lived there indefinitely, beyond the reach of bailiffs and creditors. The community developed mechanisms to resist power. When bailiffs attempted to execute warrants in Alsatia, residents would sound alarms. People poured into the streets to surround and threaten the officers. The collective protection made detention extremely hazardous. Authorities generally avoided the area rather than risk violent confrontation. Several establishments along Fleet Street had rear entrances opening into Whitefriars. A person pursued by authorities could enter a legitimate business on Fleet Street, pass through to the back, and emerge into Alsatia within seconds. The boundary between lawful commerce and protected refuge was literally a doorway. The physical integration allowed quick transitions between the legal metropolis and its shadow. The internal economy of Alsatia served the needs of people who could not participate in normal economic existence. Lodging houses rented rooms cheaply. Taverns functioned without licenses. Markets sold goods of questionable provenance. The district became self-sustaining, providing services to a population that had no legal alternatives. Other liberties operated similarly. The mint in Southwark, near the former location of a royal mint, claimed exemption from city jurisdiction. The Tower Liberty, the area surrounding the Tower of London, functioned under the constable's power rather than the city's. Smaller zones existed scattered throughout London, each claiming some degree of independence based on historical precedent or disputed ownership. Parliament addressed the problem in 1697, with legislation formally abolishing the right of sanctuary in these districts. The Act proclaimed that debtor sanctuaries had no legal standing. Bailiffs could now execute warrants in formally protected areas without legal challenge. The formal elimination of the liberties' special status did not immediately change the areas themselves. Alsatia remained a poor, heavily inhabited district with a reputation for harboring criminals. The physical characteristics that made it defensible remained. The social networks that had developed over generations persisted. The significance of the liberties was not their magnitude or inhabitants. It was what they revealed about the limits of state authority. For over a century, central powers tolerated zones within London where their authority did not extend. They did this not out of philosophical commitment to autonomy, but because enforcement was impractical. The liberties demonstrated that legal power required more than laws. It required the physical capacity to impose those laws on unwilling populations in defensible spaces. When Parliament finally moved to eliminate the sanctuaries, it did so because the expansion of professional policing and the growth of state bureaucratic capacity made enforcement possible. The liberties disappeared not because their legal claims were disproven, but because the state developed tools to overcome physical resistance. The geography of lawlessness was replaced by a geography of surveillance and domination. The Great Pestilence arrived in London in the spring of 1665. It was not the first outbreak since the Black Death of 1348. Pestilence had returned periodically throughout the intervening centuries, killing thousands in each epidemic. The 1665 outbreak, however, became the most severe since the original pandemic. The sickness followed established patterns. Initial cases appeared in the overcrowded parishes outside the settlement barriers, particularly in St. Giles in the Fields and Westminster. These areas housed the poor in circumstances that facilitated rapid transmission. Multiple households shared single rooms. Sanitation was minimal. Waste management relied on open channels and shared cesspits. Medical comprehension had not advanced significantly since 1348. Physicians still worked within the miasma framework. believing tainted atmosphere caused sickness. They recommended avoiding foul odors and maintaining distance from the sick, which had some practical benefit even though the theoretical foundation was incorrect. The concept of contagion, the idea that sickness could spread through contact with infected individuals, was gaining acceptance, but remained controversial. The Privy Council issued directives to manage the outbreak. Infected households were quarantined. A crimson cross was painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were posted outside to prevent residents from leaving. The policy trapped healthy household members inside with the sick, often condemning them to infection and death. The quarantine was enforced with penalties and confinement for violations. The metropolis established pest houses, facilities for isolating pestilence victims away from the general population. These were essentially death houses. Few who entered survived. The facilities were understaffed and undersupplied. Treatment consisted primarily of isolation until death occurred. Mass burials resumed. Pestilence pits were excavated in fields outside the built-up areas. Carts collected bodies nightly. The cry, "Bring out your deceased," became associated with the outbreak, though whether it was actually used is uncertain. What is documented is the magnitude of burial. Entire households vanished into unmarked graves. The wealthier residents escaped. Those with country estates left the metropolis for the duration of the outbreak. The royal court moved to Oxford. The legal tribunals suspended sessions. Parliament did not convene. The exodus removed the metropolis's bureaucratic and commercial leadership, leaving the poor to face the epidemic with minimal institutional support. Fatality calculations vary. Parish records suggest roughly 100,000 deaths in a metropolis of perhaps 460,000 people. The death rate was highest in the poorest parishes and lowest in areas where residents could afford to leave or to isolate effectively within their homes. The pestilence declined in the winter of 1665 to 1666. Cold weather reduced flea activity, the actual vector of transmission, though this mechanism was not understood. By early 1666, new cases had dropped significantly. The metropolis began to recover. Commerce resumed. Residents who had escaped returned. The epidemic appeared to be ending as previous outbreaks had, burning through the susceptible population and then fading. Then the metropolis burned. On September 2nd, 1666, a conflagration started at Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane near London Bridge. Farriner was the sovereign's baker. The conflagration began in the early hours, likely from an oven that had not been properly extinguished. The bakery was timber-framed with a thatched covering, typical construction for the period. London burned frequently. Small conflagrations were routine. The metropolis had firefighting procedures involving bucket chains and the use of fire hooks to pull down burning edifices and create fire breaks. The September conflagration, however, occurred during unusual circumstances. The summer had been hot and dry. Timber edifices were desiccated. A strong east wind was blowing. The conflagration spread rapidly along the riverfront, where warehouses stored flammable goods. London had become the center of global commerce. The docks held naval stores, timber, hemp, tar, and pitch for shipbuilding, sugar from the Caribbean, oils, saltpeter for gunpowder. These materials acted as accelerants. What began as a bakery conflagration became an inferno. The metropolis's fire reaction failed. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, was awakened and informed of the conflagration. He reportedly assessed the situation, declared it minor, and returned to bed. By the time the severity became apparent, the conflagration had grown beyond the capacity of conventional firefighting methods to manage. Sovereign Charles II took direct command of firefighting efforts. He commanded the creation of fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the conflagration's path. The military was deployed with gunpowder to detonate edifices. The demolitions were effective, but required time. The conflagration continued to spread faster than fire breaks could be created. The blaze burned for 4 days. It annihilated roughly 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the buildings of the city powers. The area of devastation covered roughly 436 acres within the settlement barriers and 63 acres outside them. The heat was intense enough to melt the bells in church towers and fuse pottery in cellars. The human casualty count was remarkably low given the magnitude of devastation. Official records list only 6 deaths, though this is certainly an undercount. The true figure is unknown, but likely in the dozens rather than thousands. Most residents escaped ahead of the flames. The conflagration moved slowly enough that people could flee, though they lost everything they could not carry. The conflagration's aftermath presented a choice. The medieval street arrangement of London had contributed to the disaster. Narrow passages and alleys allowed conflagration to jump between buildings. The use of timber construction provided abundant fuel. Planners, including Christopher Wren and John Evelyn, proposed complete redesign. They envisioned wide streets on a grid pattern, stone buildings, and open squares that would serve as fire breaks. The proposals failed. Property owners insisted on rebuilding on their original plots. The medieval pattern of land ownership proved more powerful than rational urban planning. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 mandated stone or brick construction and required wider streets, but the fundamental arrangement remained unchanged. The social consequences of the rebuilding requirements were significant. Stone and brick construction was expensive. Building to the new standards required capital that many former residents did not have. Hearth tax records from before and after the conflagration show that the rebuilt city had a higher proportion of wealthy households. The poorer residents were displaced to areas outside the barriers where building regulations were less strict and costs were lower. The conflagration eliminated the pestilence. Whether this was coincidence or causation remains debated. The conflagration occurred at a time when the epidemic was already declining. It annihilated the areas with the highest concentrations of poor housing, where pestilence fatality had been greatest. Whether burning contaminated edifices eliminated pestilence reservoirs or whether the timing was merely fortunate is unclear. What is definite is that 1665 was the final major pestilence outbreak in London. The sickness that had returned repeatedly for over 3 centuries vanished. The dual disaster of pestilence and conflagration in 1665 to 1666 killed tens of thousands and annihilated the medieval metropolis. The rebuilding created a different London, one constructed of stone rather than timber, with wealthier residents and stricter building codes. The transformation was not planned as urban renewal. It was the consequence of disaster, followed by regulations that excluded those who could not afford compliance. The Thames was not merely London's commercial artery. It was a jurisdiction. The High Court of the Admiralty held power over all crimes committed on the high seas and within tidal waters. This included piracy, mutiny, smuggling, and murder aboard vessels. The tribunal's authority extended from the open ocean to any point where the tide could be observed, which meant much of the Thames itself fell under maritime rather than terrestrial law. Execution Dock in Wapping served as the physical manifestation of this power. The location operated for over 4 centuries, from roughly 1400 to 1830. It was positioned on the north shore of the Thames at the low water mark, deliberately located within tidal reach to emphasize the Admiralty's jurisdiction over the waters. The ceremony of killing was carefully orchestrated. Condemned captives were detained at Marshalsea Prison in Southwark or Newgate Prison in the city. On Killing Day, they were paraded through London in a procession led by the High Court Marshal on horseback. The Marshal carried a silver oar, the symbolic staff of Admiralty power. The oar was displayed prominently to announce that this was maritime justice being dispensed. The route took captives across London Bridge and through the streets of Wapping. Masses assembled along the path. The procession moved slowly enough that spectators could observe the condemned. Some captives were intoxicated by the time they reached the dock, having been given alcohol to dull their awareness. Others were fully conscious of what awaited them. The gallows at Execution Dock differed from those used for terrestrial crimes at Tyburn. The rope was deliberately shortened. This ensured death by strangulation rather than a quick drop that might break the neck. The dying process was slow. The body's involuntary movements, as it struggled for air, were mockingly referred to as the Marshal's dance. The cruelty was intentional. Maritime crimes threatened global commerce. The state wanted the punishment to be memorable. After death, the bodies were not immediately removed. They remained hanging until 3 tides had washed over them. This practice reinforced that these were maritime offenses being punished under maritime law. The tides themselves became part of the killing, symbolically claiming the bodies for the waters where the crimes had occurred. For particularly notorious pirates, the punishment extended beyond death. The body would be taken down after the 3 tides, coated in tar for preservation, and placed in an iron cage called a gibbet. The gibbeted corpse was then displayed at a prominent location visible to vessels entering or leaving the Thames. The body would hang there for years, slowly decomposing, serving as a warning to sailors passing by. Captain William Kidd was killed at Execution Dock on May the 23rd, 1701. Kidd had been a privateer commissioned to hunt pirates, but he was convicted of piracy and murder. The trial was politically motivated. Kidd had powerful enemies and insufficient powerful allies. The evidence against him was ambiguous, but the verdict was predetermined. At his killing, the rope broke on the first attempt. Kidd fell to the ground, still alive. He was hanged again immediately. After the 3 tides, his body was gibbeted and displayed at Tilbury Point for 3 years. Vessels entering the Thames from the North Sea would pass within sight of his remains. The message was clear. Maritime power extended beyond death. The 1796 killing of 3 pirates, Colley, Blanche, and Cole, drew an immense crowd. The men had committed murder during a pirate raid. The killing became a communal spectacle. Boats were chartered on the Thames so spectators could view the hanging from the water. The riverbanks were packed with observers. The state's display of authority became entertainment, which served the state's purposes. The more witnesses, the more effective the deterrent. The final killings at Execution Dock occurred in 1830. George Davis and William Watts were hanged for mutiny and murder aboard a vessel near Cyprus. By this time, communal killings were becoming controversial. Critics argued they brutalized society rather than deterring crime. The crowds that assembled were often drunk and rowdy. The spectacle created disorder rather than demonstrating control. Execution Dock was closed shortly after the Davis and Watts hanging. Maritime killings were moved to Newgate Prison and later abolished entirely as capital punishment was gradually restricted to fewer and fewer offenses. The location of the dock is now covered by modern development. The Thames foreshore remains, accessible at low tide. The exact position of the gallows is unmarked. The significance of an Execution Dock was not the number of people killed there. It was what the location represented. The state claimed power over spaces that seemed beyond terrestrial jurisdiction. The waters themselves became subject to law enforced through ceremonial brutality. The 3 tides washing over the bodies declared that even the sea acknowledged the Crown's authority. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 restructured poverty relief across England. The old system had allowed parishes to provide outdoor relief, assistance given to the poor in their own homes. This could include cash payments, food, or fuel. The system was decentralized and inconsistent, but it allowed the destitute to maintain some connection to their communities. The new law eliminated outdoor relief for able-bodied adults. Anyone seeking assistance had to enter a workhouse. The policy was based on the principle of less eligibility. Circumstances inside the workhouse were deliberately made worse than the situation of the poorest independent laborer. The logic was that only the truly destitute would accept such circumstances, eliminating assistance to those who were merely indolent. Parishes were grouped into poor law unions, each responsible for constructing and operating a workhouse. The buildings were large, institutional edifices designed to accommodate hundreds of inmates. The architecture reflected the doctrine. High barriers surrounded the property. Small openings prevented easy flight. The arrangement separated different categories of inmates to prevent what administrators called promiscuous mixing. Upon entering the workhouse, inmates surrendered their personal clothing and possessions. They were issued uniforms that identified their status. Households were immediately separated. Husbands were sent to the men's ward, wives to the women's ward, children to separate quarters organized by age and sex. Communication between wards was strictly regulated. Married couples might not see each other for weeks. The daily routine was designed around labor. Able-bodied men broke stones for road construction or picked oakum. Oakum picking involved unraveling old rope fibers by hand. The work was tedious, repetitive, and painful. Fingers became raw. The fibers were often tarred, leaving hands blackened and chemically burned. The oakum was sold to shipyards for caulking, making the workhouses economically productive while punishing their inmates. Women were assigned laundry, cleaning, or oakum picking. The elderly and infirm who could not perform heavy labor were given lighter tasks or left to sit in day rooms with minimal activity. Children received basic education, though the quality varied widely. The curriculum focused on moral instruction and preparation for future labor. Meals were calculated to minimum nutritional requirements. Breakfast might be bread and gruel. Dinner was often potatoes or soup with small amounts of meat. Supper, repeated breakfast. The diet was deliberately monotonous and barely sufficient. Inmates were chronically hungry, but not quite starving. Scandals periodically revealed circumstances inside specific workhouses. The Andover workhouse scandal of 1845 exposed extreme abuse. Inmates assigned to bone crushing, where animal bones were broken down for fertilizer production, were found gnawing on the rotting bones to supplement their inadequate diet. The bones still had decaying meat attached. The inmates were so hungry they ate it despite the putrefaction. The revelation prompted parliamentary investigation. The master of the Andover workhouse was removed. Minor reforms were implemented, but the fundamental system remained unchanged. The scandal was treated as an aberration rather than a symptom of structural cruelty. The workhouse became a home of last resort for categories of people who had no alternatives. The elderly with no household support ended their lives there. The chronically ill were sent there when they could no longer work. Women who became pregnant outside marriage often had nowhere else to go. The mentally ill were warehoused in workhouse wards, receiving no treatment beyond confinement. Medical care was minimal. Workhouses employed medical officers, but these were often the least qualified doctors willing to work for low wages. Nursing was performed by inmates themselves, usually elderly women with no training. Medications were basic. Serious illnesses went untreated. Fatality rates in workhouse infirmaries were significantly higher than in general hospitals. Children born in workhouses faced particular disadvantages. They were stigmatized from birth. Their clothing marked them as workhouse children. When they reached working age, they were often apprenticed to employers who viewed them as cheap labor, with no household to advocate for their welfare. The cycle of destitution was reinforced institutionally. The able-bodied poor avoided the workhouse at almost any cost. They would accept wages below subsistence level. They would live in circumstances of extreme deprivation. They would beg or engage in petty crime. Anything was preferable to entering the workhouse. This was precisely the intended effect. The deterrent worked because the circumstances were genuinely worse than destitution outside. The new poor-born-poor law remained in force until 1948, when the welfare state replaced it with a system that did not require institutionalization. For over a century, the workhouse was the primary form of assistance available to the destitute. The buildings stood in every union, massive brick edifices that dominated their localities. They were designed to be visible, to serve as constant reminders of what awaited those who could not support themselves. The doctrine of less eligibility revealed assumptions about destitution. The system assumed that poverty resulted from individual moral failure rather than structural economic circumstances. It assumed that harsh treatment would incentivize self-improvement. It assumed that the poor required discipline and punishment to become productive. The workhouse did not eliminate destitution. It warehoused the consequences of poverty while making the experience of indigence as unpleasant as possible. The establishment succeeded at what it was designed to do: deter people from seeking help. Whether this constituted success or failure depends on what question is being asked. The Metropolitan Police was established by the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, created the force to address what the administration perceived as rising crime and disorder in London. The metropolis's inhabitants had grown rapidly during industrialization. Traditional methods of maintaining control, such as parish constables and night watchmen, were inadequate for a metropolis approaching 2 million residents. The new police were professional, uniformed, and centrally organized. They wore distinctive blue coats and top hats. They carried truncheons and rattles for raising alarm. They patrolled assigned beats on foot, maintaining visible presence on the streets. The force was modeled on military organization, with ranks, discipline, and chain of command. The initial communal reaction was hostile. Many Londoners viewed the police as an infringement on English liberty. The concept of a standing force of officials with authority to detain citizens seemed foreign, even tyrannical. The police were compared to French gendarmes or continental military police. Crowds sometimes attacked constables. The police were jeered as peelers or bobbies, both references to their founder, though the terms eventually lost their mocking connotation. The police mission was described as preventative. Constables were not primarily investigators of crimes already committed. Their purpose was to prevent crime through presence and moral regulation. They targeted what were called the dangerous classes, a broad category including beggars, prostitutes, street vendors, and anyone whose appearance or behavior suggested they might pose a threat to property or communal control. The Vagrancy Act of 1824, which predated the Metropolitan Police but became a primary tool for them, criminalized destitution in practical terms. The law made it an offense to sleep rough, to beg, or to loiter with intent. Intent was determined by police assessment. A constable could detain someone based on suspicion that they intended to commit a crime, even if no crime had occurred. The burden of proof shifted to the accused to demonstrate legitimate purpose. This authority allowed police to clear the streets of visible destitution. People without apparent employment or residence could be detained simply for being present in communal space. Repeat offenders faced escalating penalties, including confinement with hard labor. The law transformed the appearance of poverty into criminal behavior. Prostitution was regulated through the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s. These laws allowed police in designated garrison towns and ports to detain any woman suspected of prostitution and subject her to medical examination for venereal sickness. Suspicion was sufficient. Women walking alone at night could be stopped, questioned, and forced to undergo examination regardless of whether they were actually engaged in prostitution. The laws assumed that working-class women in communal space were potential threats to military and naval personnel. The police also enforced communal control legislation that managed how people could use space. Street musicians required licenses. Assemblies of more than a few people could be dispersed if they obstructed traffic. Political demonstrations were monitored and often broken up. The police served as regulators of acceptable communal behavior, enforcing middle-class norms about proper conduct. Detective work developed slowly. The initial Metropolitan Police Force had no detective branch. Investigation was considered incompatible with preventative policing. The first detective department was established in 1842 with only 8 officers. It expanded gradually as crime investigation became recognized as necessary police function. The police mapped the metropolis's criminal geography. They identified rookeries, dense slum districts where police presence was hazardous and conventional law enforcement difficult. Districts like St. Giles, Seven Dials, and the Devil's Acre were known as areas where criminals congregated and powers had limited mastery. Police raids into these areas were conducted in force, with constables entering in groups rather than alone. Henry Mayhew's sociological studies of the 1850s documented the criminal underworld that police sought to manage. Mayhew categorized criminals by specialty: pickpockets who worked crowded markets, area sneaks who robbed basements, smashers who passed counterfeit coins. He portrayed a social edifice with its own economy, hierarchies, and informal regulations. His work revealed that what police called criminal classes were actually communities with internal organization and survival strategies. The police relationship with these communities was adversarial, but also interdependent. Constables cultivated informants who provided intelligence on criminal activity. Informants were often criminals themselves, trading information for leniency or payment. Mayhew noted that there was no honor among thieves. Individuals readily betrayed associates to gain advantage with powers. Police corruption was endemic. Constables were poorly paid. Opportunities for bribery were constant. A blind eye to illegal activity could be purchased. Evidence could be planted or lost. The police had substantial discretionary authority over whom to detain and whom to ignore. This authority could be leveraged for personal gain. Reforms attempted to address corruption through higher pay and better supervision. The police gradually developed professional standards and internal discipline procedures, but the fundamental discretionary authority remained. A constable on the street decided whom to stop, whom to question, whom to detain. Those decisions were shaped by class, appearance, and presumptions about who constituted a threat. The existence of the Metropolitan Police changed London. The streets became subject to continuous surveillance. People learned to modify their behavior based on police presence. Working-class communities developed strategies for avoiding police attention or resisting police intervention when it occurred. The police became a permanent feature of urban existence, an establishment that mediated between the state and the inhabitants. The force expanded throughout the 19th century. By 1900, over 16,000 constables patrolled London. The police had become the primary mechanism through which the state exercised mastery over communal space and regulated the behavior of the urban poor. The original resistance to the force had faded. The police were normalized, accepted as necessary for maintaining control in a massive industrial metropolis. London's medieval waste management system was based on cesspits. These were holes excavated in the ground, often brick-lined, located beneath or near buildings. Human waste, food scraps, and other refuse were deposited into the pits. When a pit filled, it was either emptied by night soil men who removed the contents for sale as fertilizer, or it was simply covered and a new pit excavated nearby. This system operated adequately for a pre-industrial inhabitants. By the mid-19th century, it was catastrophically inadequate. London's inhabitants had grown from roughly 1 million in 1800 to over 2.5 million by 1850. The number of cesspits multiplied correspondingly. The pits leaked. The water table sat only a few meters below ground level in much of London. Waste seeped into the soil and contaminated the groundwater that fed communal pumps and private wells. The Thames itself became London's primary sewer. Over 200,000 cesspits were connected to drainage systems that emptied into the river. Industrial effluent from factories joined human waste. Slaughterhouses dumped animal remains directly into the water. Tanneries released chemical waste. The river, which had historically provided drinking water and supported fisheries, became a repository for everything the metropolis expelled. The hue and consistency of the Thames changed. It was portrayed as an opaque, pale brown fluid. The scientist Michael Faraday conducted an experiment in 1855, dropping pieces of white card into the water. They vanished instantly, invisible beneath the surface. He portrayed the river as containing filth, rolled up in clouds. The odor was overpowering, particularly in summer, when low water levels exposed mudflats coated with sewage. Cholera epidemics struck London in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866. The sickness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, leading to rapid dehydration and death, often within hours of symptom onset. Fatality was high, particularly in crowded, poor neighborhoods where water sources were most contaminated. Medical doctrine debated the cause. The dominant view held that cholera spread through miasma, tainted atmosphere rising from decaying organic matter. Physicians and communal health officials focused on eliminating foul odors, believing this would prevent sickness. They drained marshes, covered cesspits, and improved ventilation in buildings. Dr. John Snow challenged this doctrine. During the 1854 outbreak, he mapped cholera cases in Soho and found they clustered around a specific water pump on Broad Street. He hypothesized that contaminated water, not atmosphere, transmitted the sickness. He convinced powers to remove the pump handle, and new cases declined. His work suggested waterborne transmission, but the miasma doctrine remained dominant among medical powers. The crisis reached its peak in the summer of 1858. An extended period of hot weather combined with low river levels created what became known as the Great Stink. Temperatures reached 34 to 36 degrees Celsius, higher in direct sun. The exposed mudflats baked. The odor of sewage permeated central London. Parliament convened in the Palace of Westminster, which sat directly on the Thames. The stench infiltrated the building. Openings could not be accessed. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime in an attempt to mask the odor. Parliamentary business was disrupted. Members could not concentrate. Some became physically ill. The administration's reaction was rapid by the standards of Victorian bureaucracy. Legislation to fund a comprehensive sewer system was passed in 18 days. The normal parliamentary process would have taken them months or years. The Great Stink made the sewage crisis impossible to ignore because it affected the elite directly. When the problem was confined to working-class neighborhoods, action had been delayed indefinitely. Joseph Bazalgette was appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. He designed a system of intercepting sewers that would collect waste from across London and transport it eastward, away from the metropolis centre. The system relied on gravity. Sewers were constructed on a slight slope, allowing effluent to flow downstream toward the outfall points beyond the populated areas. The engineering was massive in magnitude. Over 1,300 miles of sewers were constructed. The main intercepting sewers were large enough for workers to walk through during construction and maintenance. They were constructed of brick, designed to endure. The construction employed thousands of workers over more than a decade. Several of London's ancient rivers were buried to serve as part of the system. The Fleet River, which had flowed from Hampstead Heath to the Thames, was enclosed in a brick tunnel and became the Fleet Sewer. The Tyburn, the Westbourne, and other watercourses vanished beneath the metropolis. These rivers had been open features of London's landscape for centuries. They were transformed into waste conduits, their existence known only through street designations and the occasional underground access points. The system was completed in phases. The northern intercepting sewers opened in 1865. The southern system followed. The Prince of Wales officially opened the entire network in 1875. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Cholera outbreaks, which had killed tens of thousands over the previous decades, essentially ceased. The 1866 outbreak in East London occurred in an area not yet connected to the new sewers. Once the connections were completed, waterborne epidemics vanished from London. The Thames water quality improved, though it remained far from clean. The outfalls discharged untreated sewage downstream, creating pollution problems in the estuary. Treatment facilities were added later, but the core achievement was removing waste from the immediate vicinity of where people lived and drew water. Bazalgette's sewers remained in use. The system designed in the 1850s still carries much of London's waste in the 21st century. The Victorian engineering proved durable beyond what the designers could have anticipated. The inhabitants has grown far beyond what Bazalgette planned for, requiring supplemental systems, but the original sewers continue to operate. The Great Stink forced action because it made an abstract problem concrete. The poor had been dying of cholera for decades without prompting comprehensive reaction. When the odour reached Parliament, the problem became urgent. The solution required massive communal investment and engineering on a magnitude unprecedented in civilian infrastructure. It was implemented because the alternative, continuing to live with the stench and sickness, had become politically intolerable. Coal had been burned in London since the medieval period. The metropolis's inhabitants and industry depended on it for heat and power. By the 19th century, coal consumption had reached massive magnitude. Domestic fires heated homes. Industrial furnaces powered factories. The smoke from hundreds of thousands of individual sources combined to create persistent pollution. The resulting fogs were not natural phenomena. They were mixtures of natural water vapor and coal smoke, creating what Londoners called pea soupers, for their thick, yellow-brown hue. The smoke particles provided nuclei for water droplets to condense around, creating dense fog even when meteorological circumstances alone would have produced only light mist. The fogs reduced visibility severely. During intense episodes, pedestrians could not see their own feet. Traffic stopped. People became disoriented in familiar streets. Residents tied ropes between buildings to guide themselves. The fogs were not merely inconvenient, they were poisonous. Coal smoke contained particulate matter, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and various other compounds produced during incomplete combustion. When these accumulated in still atmosphere, they created a lethal environment. Breathing became difficult, eyes burned, throats became raw. People with respiratory circumstances suffered acute attacks. Legislative attempts to manage smoke dated to the 13th century. Edward I had prohibited sea coal burning in 1272, following complaints from nobles about atmosphere quality. The prohibition was ignored because alternatives were inadequate. Wood was expensive and in short supply. The metropolis required fuel, and coal was abundant and relatively cheap. The Industrial Revolution intensified the problem. Factory furnaces burned coal constantly. Railways brought coal into the metropolis in enormous quantities. Gasworks produced coal gas for lighting, releasing additional pollution. The expansion of coal use accelerated faster than any regulatory attempt to manage it. The winter of 1952 brought circumstances that produced the most severe atmosphere pollution event in London's history. An anticyclone settled over the metropolis in early December. This created a temperature inversion. Normally, atmosphere temperature decreases with altitude, allowing warm atmosphere near the ground to rise and disperse. During an inversion, a layer of warm atmosphere sits above cold atmosphere near the surface, trapping it. The cold atmosphere at ground level was also still. No wind dispersed the accumulating pollution. Every domestic fire, every industrial furnace, every vehicle exhaust added to the concentration. The pollutants could not escape vertically because of the inversion or horizontally because there was no wind. The Great Smog began on December the 5th. Visibility dropped rapidly. By afternoon, the metropolis was shrouded in thick fog that had a distinct yellow-green tint. The odor was acrid. The atmosphere tasted of sulfur. People covered their faces with scarves or handkerchiefs, which provided minimal protection. Communal transport struggled to function. Buses could not navigate streets they could not see. The underground continued to run, but stations filled with people seeking refuge from the outdoor atmosphere. Cinemas closed because visibility inside the theaters was too poor. The smog penetrated buildings through any opening. The pollution levels during the smog were extreme. Estimated daily emissions included 1,000 tons of smoke particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 370 tons of sulfur dioxide, and 14 tons of fluorine compounds. The sulfur dioxide reacted with water vapor to form sulfuric acid. The fog droplets became dilute acid mist that coated everything it contacted. Health effects were immediate. Hospitals reported surges in admissions for respiratory distress. Pneumonia and bronchitis cases spiked. The elderly and those with pre-existing circumstances were most vulnerable. Many perished in their homes, unable to reach hospitals. The smog lasted 5 days. On December 9th, wind finally dispersed the accumulated pollution. The metropolis returned to normal atmospheric circumstances. The immediate crisis ended, but the casualty count continued to accumulate. People who had been weakened during the smog perished in subsequent weeks from complications. Contemporary calculations placed the casualty count at roughly 4,000. Later examination revised this figure upward. Modern epidemiological studies suggest that 12,000 deaths were attributable to the 1952 smog, when excess fatality in the months following the event is included. The deaths were concentrated among the elderly, infants, and those with cardiovascular or respiratory sickness. The administration's initial reaction was minimal. Officials suggested the deaths were unfortunate but not preventable. Fog was a natural feature of London weather. The suggestion that pollution could be managed through regulation faced resistance from industry and from those who viewed smoke as an inevitable consequence of economic activity. Communal pressure mounted. The magnitude of death could not be ignored. Parliamentary investigation followed. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1956, 4 years after the smog. The law established smoke management areas where only smokeless fuel could be burned. It required industry to reduce emissions. It provided subsidies to help households transition away from traditional coal fires. Implementation was gradual. Smokeless zones expanded over years. Alternative heating methods, including gas and electric, became more common. The coal fires that had heated London homes for centuries were phased out. The change was driven by legislation, but legislation was driven by the undeniable evidence that the atmosphere had become lethal. The improvement in atmosphere quality was measurable. Fog frequency decreased. The characteristic yellow pea soupers became rare, then vanished entirely. London's atmosphere remained polluted by modern standards, particularly from vehicle emissions, but the extreme smog events ended. The 1952 disaster was the final of its kind. The Great Smog demonstrated that environmental circumstances could reach levels that killed thousands of people in a modern metropolis. It showed that industrial activity and domestic fuel use had consequences that extended beyond economic calculation, and it proved that regulatory intervention could change fundamental patterns of behavior when the alternative was measured in thousands of deaths. The poisonous atmosphere was not inevitable. It was a choice, maintained until the cost became too high to sustain.